Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Katerina Shrey, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett and Dr. Chris White, on behalf of Anara Tablishieva, and with our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host Ukraine, a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine, with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally, and we very much appreciate your comments and feedback. Many thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this event possible. If you're joining us live, please feel free to use the chat to post questions for our guest. I'm going to say a quick greeting to our viewers in Ukraine and ask the rest of us, other than speakers, to turn off our cameras to conserve our bandwidth. Quick greeting to our viewers in Ukraine. Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі. And I'm so happy and excited to introduce today's guest. I'm very grateful to introduce Dr. Karen Petrone and welcome her back to our program. Dr. Petrone was our guest on April 15, 2022, shortly after Russia attacked Ukraine, and we're so happy to have her back with us today. She is a professor of history and the inaugural director of the Cooperative for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Kentucky. She's also the co-director of the UK-JHF Holocaust Education Initiative. Dr. Petrone served as the chair of UK's Chemistry History Department and was named the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor in 2017-2018. Her primary research interests are cultural history, gender history, propaganda, war and memory, and the history of subjectivity in everyday life, especially in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Dr. Petrone is the author of Life Has Become More Joyous, Comrades, Celebration in the Time of Stalin, and The Great War in Russian Memory. And I'm putting the Amazon link to the latter of those books in the chat. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled Reading War Memory in Putin's Russia. Dr. Petrone, we are so grateful you're able to join us today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Victor Fett, Chris White, and of course to you, Katerina Shrey, for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Just one quick clarification on the bio. I think that must have been the UK webpage going crazy. I was the chair of the history department, not the chemistry department.
Oh, Jesus, I apologize. That's me. That's not the website. So yeah, to our viewers, I apologize. I don't know where that came from. I apologize. Thank you so much for that clarification. Holy cow.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting joint department, history and chemistry, but
I can see that.
No worries.
All right, I'm gonna turn off my camera to preserve the quality of our video, and very grateful for your presentation. We'll all be listening attentively and gratefully.
Oh, thank you, and I hope to sort of to speak for about half hour and give us some time to talk, some time to think through some of these ideas. If you want to go ahead and start the PowerPoint, you can probably go ahead to the second slide is fine. So the next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so this presentation is a little bit, sort of far afield and away from the day-to-day or current events of the war, but is in fact about the sort of the broader ideological context in which Russia is fighting this war, and the ways in which over the past 20 years, Russia has been building that sort of warlike context. It's a part of a larger work that explores the use of war memory in the renationalization, remasculinization, and remilitarization of Russia since the year 2000. And this is a part of a larger work. Really, the Great War in Russian Memory looked at the period of revolutionary years from 1917 to 1932, and the ways in which what was permissible to say about war was opened up during the revolutionary years and narrowed during the Stalin years. And in a way, this book is the larger project is looking at the opposite end, looking at the ways in which what was permissible to say about war in Russia was opened up very dramatically in the glasnost years and the 1990s, and how it is being systematically closed down since the year 2000. So it's really about the sort of question of is how to look at war, what it's permissible to say about war, and really the ways in which since 2000 and especially since 2012, there has been a lot of emphasis on war, really emphasis and propaganda and ideology about war as this glorious, heroic thing. And all the kinds of ideas that maybe challenge the idea of a heroic war are being limited. So that's the broader context. The specific thing I want to talk about today is Russia's war myth. And I say war myth in the singular in some ways, because one of the ideological underpinnings of what is going on in Russia today is that there's just one war that Russia fights over and over again. Time is cyclical, and this war just repeats, over and over. And there are two possible outcomes to this war. When Russians are unified, they are victorious. When they are divided, they descend into a time of troubles. And this is, of course, the original idea. The time of troubles, or smuta, was in 1598, the interregnum between 1598 and 1613. So really, there are only, now obviously this is a gross simplification of reality. This is not true, but this is a kind of ideological underpinning that I want to explore with you today. Just so you know, it does not originate with me. Greg Carlton in Russia, The Story of War, really talked about the cyclical nature of war memory. And I hear what I'm doing, and also Yekaterina Klimenko and Dan Rowland have done analyses based on this idea as well. So this is not new to me. What is new to me is the attempt to sort of look at it and systematize it within the system of war memory, and to poke at how it works and the different elements that go into it in the current moment, which none of the obviously, well, actually Dan Rowland has a little bit. Actually, Dan Rowland and Yekaterina Klimenko are sort of pursuing this in the current moment, but I'm trying to do this as well, and trying to really provide the details for how this war myth works within a Russian context today. And so the book, Reading War Memory in Putin's Russia, it focuses on many different wars: World War I, the Revolution and Civil War, World War II, and the war in Afghanistan, and sort of looks at how the mythology around those wars is being built up in the contemporary moment. Next, please. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna start talking about let me just say one thing about the who of who's doing this, which I meant to say earlier. Especially since 2012, there's been lots of ideological forces at the top of the Russian government that have been pushing toward sort of creating ideological war memory, and these include the Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky. This includes the Russian Orthodox Church. This includes the new Russian History Society and the Russian Military History Society. And it includes a lot of new institutions that are being created. And what you see here is, and this is really a stunning thing. Vast amounts of money have been invested in a new museum on the Kulikova battlefield. And you can sort of see the museum is built into the battlefield in a beautiful example of modern art. And I want to talk about Kulikova because it's one of the nodes in the cycles. And in 16th century war ideology under Ivan the Terrible, when the cycles of war, the war that Russia is repeating are biblical. So in icons, for example, sometimes Russian warriors are represented as the ancient Israelite armies, and moving backward in time all the way to ancient Israel. On the other hand, sometimes they're also represented as the army of God at Armageddon. And so then that is also playing with time and moving it forward rather than backward. So I want to talk about these nodes of battle, because it creates a kind of idea of a circular time where the same where the same sort of events are repeating over and over again, and therefore it challenges linear time, and you can move forward and backward in time. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the opening gallery of the Kulikova Museum, which helps to prove my point. Okay, so here you have these are the three wars that are considered the battlefields of military glory. One is Kulikova, where a conglomeration of the princedoms around what was in Kiev and Rus essentially at the time, but led by the Muscovites, were victorious in beating back the Mongols. Never mind that the Mongols sacked Moscow 2 years later, and it actually took another 100 years before the Mongol Empire was finally defeated in the Russian lands. But nonetheless, the Battle of Kulikova is this moment of important resonance where the Russians unified, and because they were unified, they were able to beat the enemy. Then we have 1812, and of course that's the first. The Battle of Borodino is what is being noted there. Again, the battle where Napoleon was not precisely defeated, but eventually ended up a step in the eventual defeat of Napoleon. And very important that during that war, the entire Russian population rose up to fight for Napoleon, fight against Napoleon. I'm sorry. But to fight in the war with Napoleon. Now, mind you, these are myths, right? All of these things are based on simplifications and sometimes outright falsehoods, right? This is a narrative. The narrative I'm telling you is the narrative about how Russia imagines its wars. It is not necessarily what actually happened on the battlefields at any given moment, right? So please understand that this is ideology, and I'm not making great claims about Russian nationalism, but rather I'm talking about how the Russian narratives are working in ideological terms. So 1812 is Borodino, the battle against Napoleon. The whole Russian society rises up against Napoleon, and it is the Great Fatherland War, the first one, right? We know about the Second World War being called the Great War of the Fatherland. Well, the Napoleonic Wars were the War of the Fatherland, right? The first one, Отечественная война. Then the third third battlefield of military glory is the tank battle at Prokhorovka in 1943. And what we see here is this idea that these are battles that are so important to Russia, but they're also, in essence, the same battle, right? Sort of people come and the Mongols invade. We have the battle at Kulikova. The Napoleon invades. We have the Battle of 1812. The Nazis invade. We have the battle against them in 1943. And so you have this sort of circular time with the same battle being played out over and over again. Unified Russians mean winner. Unified Russians means victory. When Russians are divided, then you have a problem. Next slide, please. I would also add here, by the way, before we go, that this gorgeous museum that must have cost, hundreds of millions of rubles to build, if not more, is kind of in the middle of nowhere because it's on where the supposed original battle site for this battle was, and it's 275 kilometers southeast of Moscow. And when I went there from Tula, it took 2 hours in a taxi on very bumpy roads, and the taxi driver was kind of angry at me that I was making him go on these bumpy roads. So it's kind of an interesting, sort of there's an enormous amount of infrastructure development in that spot when it's not exactly clear how many people are going to be, getting out there on a yearly basis. So the question of unity is really an important question, but also the question of what is the next node in that cycle, right? And the question that I really want us to think about, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss fully in the second part of this talk, is how is Russia imagining their invasion of Ukraine in this context? is Putin consciously or unconsciously trying to create that next node in the victory, that next war? And what is the implication if we begin to look at the Ukraine war in that context? There has been no unifying battle since the end of the Second World War. And in fact, there have been, sort of times of trouble. And so it seems to me that there's a kind of ideological pull in this idea to make the invasion of Ukraine the next node in this battle. And so that's something that I want us to think about together, because I haven't really, sort of placed Ukraine in that context yet. But I'm interested in all your thoughts about how that will work. What does that mean? What are the implications of that ideological framing for Ukraine? Okay, so the problem with Russia's war myth is that the opposite also exists in the war myth: the disunity, the dissolution, the destruction of the sort of national idea, occupation, revolution, civil war, dissolution, and periodically throughout Russian history, you have these moments as well. The most famous one being the time of troubles from 1598 to 1613. That's where this idea of smuta or troubles comes. But even the dissolution that allowed the Mongols to invade is a node in this civil war problem. Then, of course, the civil war from 1918 to 1921 is a big problem in terms of this narrative. And then the fall of the Soviet Union is another node in this narrative. These are times of troubles. These are smuta. And so the problem, or the interesting thing about the narrative, is it has this sort of cyclical idea of victory, but it also has this cyclical idea of collapse. And I think that's something that is worth thinking about. If people are thinking about creating the next node in victory, are they also fearing the next node of collapse? And it's very important to note that when the Russian government decided I think in 2005, to change the November 7th holiday, to get rid of the October Revolution anniversary holiday, they created a holiday called Unity Day on November 4th. And November 4th is important because it harkens back yet to another episode in the cyclical history of Russia. The holiday was first created by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in 1649 on the feast day of Our Lady of Kazan, to celebrate the expulsion of the Polish invaders in 1612, and then eventually the election of the first Romanov to be Tsar in 1613. So Unity Day celebrates the end of a civil war rather than November 7th, which celebrates the beginning of a time in which caused a civil war, right? So we're sort of seeing, even in the civic structure of Russia today, this idea of unity above all being put into place in holiday commemorations, in the creation of new traditions around unity and rejecting revolution, civil war, dissolution, occupation, et cetera, et cetera. It's also important to note in this slide, as you can see, that Patriarch Kirill is right beside Putin there in the picture. And what's notable about this and a lot of the rest of this rhetoric is the ways in which religious rhetoric and secular rhetoric are all mixed up, right? This is the holiday of Unity Day is a national holiday, but it's also the religious holiday of Our Lady of Kazan. And it is celebrated here by both Putin and Patriarch Kirill. And a lot of this resonance of circular time and linear time, circular time is against linear time, and it creates a kind of possibilities for the transcendent, right? Time is immemorial. It is moving forward. It is moving backward. You can have God at Armageddon. You can have the ancient Israelite army. You can have all of these things in the same time scale. And so it pulls the idea of history out of this sort of secular linear space and moves it into a much more transcendent cyclical moment, which has its dangers as well as it has ideological benefits perhaps for the Russian state, but it has dangers in terms of the kinds of thinking that it might permit. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the another museum, right? So I'm framing this memory of war by looking at museums. I mean, I do it in other ways in the manuscript as well, but for the moment, I'm looking at a couple of museums. And I showed you the one at Kulikova Field. This is another museum called Russia: My History, which is defined as an exhibition center, a historical park. Sometimes it's called a living textbook, but it's the largest exhibition space in Russia. And what they did was they created a set of exhibits, and they cloned them so that there are 26 museums with identical exhibits in them, going all the way from St. Petersburg to in the St. Petersburg in the north, to Makhachkala in Dagestan in the south, and all the way to the east, where there are branches in Vladivostok and in Sakhalinsk. So there are a couple of things that are very interesting about this this exhibit. One is that it came out of the Russian Orthodox Church's celebration of Victory Day. In 2013 and 2014, there were exhibits about the Romanovs and about the Rurikid dynasties that were sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church. And these exhibits were then, sort of given a lot of money. Some people argue by Gazprom and also by the Russian government in order to be transformed into this museum and exhibition space. The first permanent space opened up in Moscow in the VDNH Exhibition Center, and then they began to clone them and open up new ones all over the place. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see the map. So these are just the first 24, but I'd like you to go to the next slide, please, to talk a little bit about the trajectory of these. The 25th and 26th branches of this museum have been built in occupied Ukraine. And the intention, obviously, here, in Luhansk and in Melitopol, here's what I have there is the home page for the Luhansk museum, and you can see it says, your museum is in Luhansk, and then there's the list for the exhibit about the Romanovs. But what I want to think about here is the ways in which this idea of a standard narrative of Russian history is intentionally being placed in occupied Ukraine in order to Russify Ukraine. So the idea is clearly that the populations in these areas are going to be Russian, and the way that they're going to learn about how to be Russian is to go to such a place that's called Russia: My History, and even the title there sort of implies the imperial idea of these museums. And so these museums have been criticized extensively by professional historians. Their narratives are simplified. They're often incorrect. They're amateurishly done. The displays are not very beautiful, but on the other hand, they're interactive. A lot of them have really nice technology. A lot of money has been spent on the kind of the technological aspects of these museums, and also on the replication of them over and over again in all these different places. And so you can go to Vladivostok or you could go to Luhansk and see the same exhibit about the Romanovs. And I think that that's a very important to understand as we think about the representation of Russia's war as cyclical. I think it's very important for us to be able then also to think about the ways in which those ideological ideas about war and the ideological ideas about Russian history are being transmitted in this very intentional and in imperial fashion all across the expanse of the Russian Federation. And I think that that's something that we have to sort of factor in here. So it's not just about this cyclical war myth about the polar opposites between unity and dissolution and civil war, but that myth is being promulgated, the ideology, the propaganda is being spread out across the Russian Federation in a very intentional way. And we see this again in the creation of the new 20th century textbooks that were just put out in August, with the idea that every student in a school anywhere in the Russian Federation is going to get the same narrative about Russian history. Oh, and by the way, that narrative is going to be very skewed in certain ways, and very making a lot of omissions. But it's going to be unified textbooks across the expanse of the geography, and unified museums across the expanse of the geography. So I want to show you a little bit about the awkward chronology of these museums, to give you a sense about how anxiety about civil war plays even in the very nature of the way these museums were set up. So if we can go to the next. Okay, so these are the. This is the. So there are originally there were four chronological exhibits. The first one is the Rurikevici from 1862 to 862, 862 to 1598. And what I have here in these two, I have the next slide, but hold on, don't go there yet. Then you have Russia, My History, 1945 to 2016. It was listed as 2016 because that was when it was created, right? But the problem is, how do each of these exhibits start and end, right? The Rurikid exhibit begins with the very first Rurikid, begins with the calling of the Varangians in 862, and it ends with the death of Ivan the Terrible with no heirs in 1598. That creates the dramatic interregnum, right? So that's sort of interesting. Keep in mind 1945 to 2016, and let's go to the next slide. And here you have the two in the middle of those two, right? The Romanovs, 1613 to 1917. Note that one doesn't end well, right? That's an exhibit where the end of the exhibit is dissolution, just like the Rurikids, right? The Rurikids and the Romanovs both end in this sort of dissolution moment. But we have the other exhibit on the left-hand side, which is from the Great Shakeup, from the Great, what's the exact translation? From the Great Shocks to the Great Victory. And here we have a whole cycle of the war myth, right, in that one exhibit. The Russians were disorganized, they were disunified, they this one goes 1917. Sometimes they started in 1914. They were disrupted. They were disunified. They had a collapse, but they pull themselves back together, get themselves back in order, and are able to redeem the collapse with the great victory in 1945. Right. So here we sort of see these exhibits, some of them end on the sort of the bad note of dissolution, but this one in particular ends on the very good note of the most glorious victory in the great patriotic war. And I think that's an important element. Yeah. That is a really good question. I would have to look a little closer. I think that must be one of the interactive tables, right? I think there was a question about what are those triangles there. That is a really great question. I think that must be one of the interactive pieces. I'll have to look into that a little bit further. I think I will need to blow that up a little bit to find that out. Great. So one of the things that's important to note about the exhibit from 1945 to the present is that since the war in Ukraine, That exhibit has been closed in many museums. In fact, in Moscow, all 4 of these are closed, but in some of the regional museums, many of them are open. But so far, of all the museums that I looked at, only that last one from 1945 to 2016 was only on display in Kazan and in Novosibirsk. And so I'm, I imagine that part of the problem here is that they are trying to realign that exhibit based on what's going on in the Ukraine war. But the fact that it's closed also suggests to me some kind of anxiety about the lack of about the open-endedness of it, right? How is this moment from 1945 to X date going to end? Are we going to have unity and victory, or are we going to have dissolution and civil war and sort of and other kinds of negative catastrophes for Russia? And so I think that even the exhibit, because of the circular war narrative, these exhibits are fraught even of themselves as they've been put together. And it's clear that those who have written the exhibits are also aware of this and are particularly concerned about the exhibit from 1945 to the present, to try to understand how to represent Putin's Russia in that moment, and how to represent the current moment given this sort of tradition of war mythology. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Right, and this is in the Russia My History Museum, and it's in the Rurikid exhibit, and it shows the sort of the idea that they're trying to create around the Mongol invasion, which is one of the nodes of this war myth, that all of the different city-states are there, but they are fragmenting, right? So it's focusing on their fragmentation, on their lack of unity, and note, of course, that Kiev is there, and Kiev and actually and Galitsky and Volinsky, right? I mean, there's all of the Western princedoms are there as part of Kievan Rus, and the idea is that they are fragmenting and falling apart, and that is what allows the Mongols to invade. Next slide, please. And then here is the opposite. Gumilyov is a famous sort of late Soviet thinker who had some very eccentric ideas, some anti-Semitic ideas, but was very interested in Eurasianism. But he is also very much quoted in a lot of these exhibits. And he points out here that the overarching significance of the Battle of Kulikovo is that Suzdalians, Vladimirians, Rostovians, Pskovians went to fight in Kulikovo field as representatives of their princedoms, but they returned from that field as Russians. And so the narrative arc here is that fragmentation of Kievan Rus being turned into the unity that is, of course, brought by none other than our friends, the Muscovites, right? And so we then sort of push the idea of Kievan Rus and into 1,000 years of Russian statehood, never mind all the other princedoms, the other possible statehoods, the other possible trajectories for these places. And so you can sort of see why Kulikovo is important in that narrative, because it pulls the sort of center of statehood into Moscow, and then it becomes, from the point of view of the Russians, self-evident that that's the way it was, and that's the way it always was going to be, and that means automatically that Russia's statehood is 1,000 years old, going back and taking the heritage and the lineage of the Rurikids. So this is what I wanted to share with you in terms of sort of thinking about the big picture, right? These are history museums and other sort of historical aspects of the contemporary Russian moment that are really designed not only to affirm Russian statehood and engage Russian nationalist patriotic thinking, but also to sort of draw people into this war narrative where unity will bring victory, disunity will bring defeat, and to really prepare people to be in that, to be, to take part in that, not just the narrative of war, but actually in the current moment, real war. And so I have for us, and I hope we can have a lively discussion here. I'm happy to answer questions too, but I have some questions for us as to discuss, to kind of think through. And one of those questions is, obviously you can, in terms of ideology, you can create all the ideology you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people believe it, right? That's the first question, to what extent. And, we have seen a lot of passivity on the part of the Russian population, but we've also seen a lot of they have a lack of information as well. So the question is, sort of how effective is this stuff, right? We don't need to assume that just because this ideology is well elaborated and interesting, interestingly powerful, that it actually is reaching people. And so, that's a question that we should be asking ourselves. The other question is, what are the implications for the Russian, the Russian military mindset, the Russian soldiers' mindset, the Russian population's mindset about the invasion of Ukraine and the war that's going on there? How, does this sort of, are they fitting it into this cyclical war model, and in what ways does that shape and reframe how the Ukraine war is being understood? So those are sort of two big questions that I am, would like to put on the table for us to think about. In the, if you want, we can go ahead and open the floor. And I see a hand up already, and maybe we could end the PowerPoint so we can see each other, or at least.
Oh, yes, I'm very happy to welcome to the program Dean Leonard Deutsch, former Dean of Marshall's Graduate Program and a very good friend of our program.
Hi. Reportedly, Putin wrote a position paper 1 year before invading Ukraine, perhaps providing a historical justification.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree does his position or his paper conform to your analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and to what extent does it depart from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally understood. He wrote the whole. It's about the, it's about how Crimea, right? The position paper is about how Crimea is really Russia, right? I think that was is that the one that you're making a reference to? It?
Yes.
Yeah. And that fits right into this, right? So some people argue that it was not Putin that wrote it, but Vladimir Medinsky, who is the Minister of Culture, and then Putin sort of took it over. So the people who look at Medinsky as an ideological figure, and I think here Jade McGlynn has done some work on this. They see this all as a part of a concerted effort to use history. So Jade McGlynn wrote a book called History Makers, which is looking at Medinsky and the Ministry of Culture and all these other folks. And the idea is that there is a concerted effort to use history in order to justify the goals of the Russian state, and that paper was written specifically, sort of in this vein, right? I don't know that it's like it's a little different from the circular war models, but it's very consistent with this ideological program. I mean, it's not that it's not the same, it's just that it's a different aspect of it, but it's part of the same ideological program to claim Crimea, to claim, the territories of Ukraine as theirs from time immemorial. And why would you even think that they were anything else? Because of the I believe the baptism of Vladimir is important here, right? So that's the baptism of the first Rurikid king, and that took place in Kherson, and so that's why Crimea is dear to Russia, because the first Russian leader, who is actually a Ukrainian, well, actually a Scandinavian, but never mind. Like who Vladimir was is not important, but it's taking hold of the whole history of that region from 862 and saying that's Russia all the way, right? Moscow didn't exist, right? In 1862, there was no such place as Moscow on the map, right? That Moscow is not created till the 11th century, 12th century. So what the Russian state is doing here is saying that all of that territory to the east that belonged to the Russian Empire, later on, was always and ever part of Russia, right? And that the calling of the Varangians, when the Slavic tribes couldn't protect themselves from the steppe peoples, and they called the Scandinavian princes to come and help them. Like from that moment on, it was Russia, 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 and the center of Russianness was Moscow. But of course, Moscow didn't exist in 862, right? This is all rewritten past the, this is rewritten in time, and it was actually rewritten by the Muscovite ideologues at first. You have to like think about this in the longest sweep. The first time that this claim over all of Kievan Rus was made was not by Putin, but in fact by Ivan the Terrible's ideologues in the 15th and 16th century, who were trying to claim for Muscovy the entire region.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so this is, in some ways, this is about Muscovy's claim that is then claimed again by Putin, and Vladimir Medinsky very neatly created this what they call the 1,000-year. Jonathan Brunstad, who's another war and memory scholar, he calls this the 1,000-year flow of Russian history. But in order to have that 1,000-year flow, you have to recapture those first several hundred years where there was no Moscow, and somehow make them Muscovite. Because you need Muscovy. Muscovy is the sort of Muscovy then turns into the Russian Empire eventually, but you have to make Muscovy seem as if it always existed, and that it was the natural inheritor to these the early states of Rus that were not Russian. They were many different city-states.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope that's not too complicated answer to the question.
Oh, that was great. Very enlightening. Thank you so much. And thank you. Your presentation is absolutely beautiful in that it puts the current events into like a much larger, wider pattern, which is absolutely fascinating to see. And the idea of museums to basically convert people's identities, like strategically placed. This is genuinely interesting, very news to me. So thank you so much. I'm wondering if we have any questions from our panel or any of our regulars, if they would like to jump in. Oh, Carol Smith. Oh, okay. All right, Dr. Chris White. Dr. Chris White, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Carol Smith. Hello, Chris.
So I also noticed that you have a strong background on comparative history too. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if there are some comparisons that maybe people in other fields could kind of relate to, or maybe even contrast to what's going on right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting, this is all a part of this frame is the history of nationalism, right? This is something when, the rise of the nation state is a, transnational phenomenon, not just Europe, but everywhere. And one of the most famous books about what makes a nation state is Benedict Anderson's Origins of, I forget now the title of the book, but his basic argument is that print culture is what creates nations. And so I think that when you see, the first thing I think of when I think of these museums that are being spread across the whole Russian Federation, and even in contested territories, is that it's this idea, imagined communities. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's what I had a little brain fart there. That to me is a very comparative moment, right? That is to say, this is the way that this ideology is being disseminated is very similar to the way that nation states, as they were being built up, and all over the world, not just in, you could look at this in in Latin America and Asia, all of these different places. They are seeking to create this imagined community, and this is a really good example of watching how it works, because it's a very overt kind of creation of a unified, or the attempt to create a unified geographic space, where somebody in Vladivostok is doing the same thing as somebody in Makhachkala. And that's really, to me, a very important aspect of comparative understanding of nation building. I think that's one of the sort of the big picture items here. The other sort of the questions about mythology and war myths, I think this is sort of one of my larger arguments is a philosophical one, is that every nation wants to, and here, again, I'm thinking about nation state, right? This is really, my story is really about the nation state in certain ways. Every nation state wants to mobilize its population for war. It wants to, part of national citizenry is being willing to fight and die for your country. This is sort of a standard part of sort of national identity. But in order to do that, in order to make people, think it is sweet and fitting to die for the nation, as the poetry would say, is that you have to hide how awful war really is, right? And you have to, sort of make it seem like war is the, sort of the obvious, that war is a logical, a natural choice, when in fact it isn't, right? It creates destruction, and it's, there's not a lot. It's making war natural, making war, as Jay Winter says, making war thinkable. And so my comparative work here is about how do nations try to make war thinkable. And here, patriotism, strict gender roles, the creation of a nation that has to be defended, the idea of it, that everybody in the nation is together from one side to the other. Those are all the things that make war thinkable, make war possible. And a lot of times, what we're seeing here is also the censorship of things about war that aren't nice, things about war that are ugly, things about war that make it clear that it's unheroic. The fact that soldiers in war, they're not so honorable sometimes. Sometimes they are stealing, sometimes they're raping, sometimes they're killing prisoners of war. These kinds of, the ugly side of war is systematically removed. And I think that big picture of comparative understanding of creating a militarized, mobilized national ideal, and the things that you have to do, the things you have to suppress in order to create that model, I think that is I think fairly comparable in many other societies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Carol Smith, or I'm sorry, I mean to steal your thunder.
It's okay.
Hi, Katerina. Hi, Karen. Thank you so much. I have a semi-formed thought. I teach mental health counseling, and I specialize in trauma counseling, teaching students how to become trauma-informed therapists. So just before joining this meeting, I was in another training on human trafficking. And the speaker brought up a book called The Natashas. I haven't read it. And it's about how in Eastern Europe, women from Eastern Europe, because of their attractive looks, have been trafficked. And they're all referred to as Natasha. Their names don't matter anymore. No. And they are systematically abused by their traffickers in order to think that it's okay to be trafficked, and to actually purposefully create what we call dissociation in the mental health world. And basically, dissociation is a protective state when you're under immense duress that says this is either not happening or it's not happening to me. Somebody else is taking it for me. So I'm thinking about everything that you've said, and thinking about this book, The Natashas, and this intentional use of torturing these women to the point where they invoke dissociation in these women in order to get absolute compliance for them to be trafficked. And it feels like there's something very familiar going on here. And are you relating at all to what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I absolutely am. I mean, I think that I guess it's interesting because this is about this is about war trauma. This is about, but in some ways it's the flip of what you're saying, right? I would almost sort of argue that it's really an interesting, like the women are intentionally being traumatized in order to to create the dissociation. In the case of Russia's wars, I think in some ways the population is the trauma is being suppressed for, that all the things that these people experienced in war is being, in some ways, rewritten in this heroic form that discounts and eliminates the kinds of experiences that people really had. So I almost think, in some ways, I hear what you're saying, right? What's in common is this kind of systematic dealing with, systematic use of trauma. But in the case of Russia's wars, it's systematic, I don't know, suppression of it. Does that make sense? I'm not a therapist, so does that make any sense to you? Does that
Yeah,
resonate with you?
it's like they're going around opposite sides of the same bush, to speak
Yeah.
metaphorically.
Yeah.
But it just feels like the intentional manipulation of
Mhm.
identity in both
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes,
and
absolutely. That is also
and
in common.
and and forcing a particular line of thinking that this is the way you're going to think. And I'm just I'm sorry, I don't know how else to say this. I'm just struck by how evil that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And
That truth is not truth. And when truth stops being truth, then what do you do? Like, where do we go from there?
Yeah.
And I'm also struck again by the length of time we're talking about. I mean, we live in America. We're, what is it, 250 years old?
Mhm.
I mean, we don't have any comprehension of what it means to have a history going back to the, the 3-digit years.
Right, right.
And
Yeah,
so what is it with, I'm thinking about the United States and our swashbuckling sort of adolescent attitudes about things. And and in the face of this kind of history and the longevity of it. I don't know. I'm in a learning mode here, so I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. No, I think I think what you've underlined there is this is an attempt at manipulation in certain ways, right? And this is an attempt to manipulate the narratives of history so that people sort of fall in line and accept this idea, accept the idea that war is natural, accept the idea that it is, everyone should be ready to die for their country, except, all nations do this, but I think the level of manipulation here is higher. And I absolutely agree with that. In terms of the length of history, absolutely. But there are many ways to read this history, and I think you could find. I'm sure if you found a Ukrainian scholar of the early modern period, they would have a lot to say about this narration of the 1,000-year stream of Russian history, right? Because it eliminates the possibility of Ukrainian statehood. It denies the idea that there was a Ukrainian state before there was even a Moscow. And I think that is a kind of, it's a big lie kind of a situation, but it's one that the Muscovite ideologists have been writing for 500-600 years. Well, 500 years, right? So 1500 to 500 years. And that's really interesting, right? Is that the sort of manipulation didn't start under Putin. It's just very interesting to watch how it's evolved under Putin, but it didn't start under Putin. In some ways, it started in the monk cells around the monasteries around the Kremlin in the 15th, 16th centuries.
So do you have a sense that Ukraine and Russia will always be at war?
No, well, I think that that's a really hard question. I
Sorry.
think that I think there's no reason why. I think that there's not, okay, so this gets at the idea of national identity being constructed versus inborn. A lot of the ideologues in Russia think of national identity as something that is inborn. You're just because of, who are your mother and father, that makes you innately Russian, and there's this innate Russianness, right? But our sort of 20th and 21st century understandings of national identity is that it's constructed. It has to be created every single day, not just in Russia, but everywhere, right? That the idea of being an American is just as constructed as being a Russian, except that I think that, under Putin, this identity is being manipulated in certain kinds of ways that isn't necessarily the case in the United States always. But this idea of constructedness that things don't have to be the way they are. That nations don't have to be organized the way that they're organized now. I think that undercuts this idea that there always has to be a Russia because that's the way it always was, right? There's no good reason why there shouldn't be a Ukrainian nation state if the Ukrainians want a nation state and they have constructed a nation state and they've agreed on this since 1991. But Russia doesn't like that because the Russian ideologues don't like that because they're imagining their state as going back 1,000 years to when they claimed that land. But that's just as artificial. All of these are artificial, right? All nations are created. And I think that that's important, that we all are doing this creating in the United States, in Russia, in Ukraine. But there's nothing natural about the Russian state as it sits now. There's nothing natural about the Ukrainian state or the American state as it sits now. And we have to kind of, any kind of claim that's like, well, Ukraine was always ours because we go back 1,000 years. That is a story that the Russians are telling themselves in order to get legitimacy. Sorry, I hope that's not. The constructedness of national identity is a really important thing. This is true. The same is true for gender identities, right? I mean, that we can do another whole conversation about that. But this idea is constructed, and so therefore, it doesn't. There's no more or less legitimacy for one or for the other. Yes, there's a hand up.
Yes, I'm a former Marshall student who attends these programs semi-regularly, and one of the things that I don't think we've gotten into quite as much that you raised as a possible topic of discussion was dealing with how much these museums are actually affecting people, if people are actually going to them, and I think on some level, we have to look beyond just the museums to see how the Russian state is trying to propagate its view of history, and also look at the mass media, because obviously a lot of people watch television, and I'm sure they try to disseminate their ideology through that. Another thing that I have an interest and some knowledge in is film studies, and taking a look at some of the output of Russian film studios in recent years compared to in the past might offer some illumination, because even at the height of the Soviet Union in, say, the 1960s and the like, there were some movies that portrayed various episodes of Russian history, such as World War II, in a very ambiguous light. For instance, there's Tarkovsky's Ivan's Childhood, which is about a child soldier, I believe, in World War II. So being a child soldier, it's going to be very dark in some way. He's focusing on his trauma and things like that. Whereas I think a lot of more recent Russian films, such as there was one from a few years back called T-34, I think, named after the Russian tank. And I think from what I've read about that one, it portrays war in a much more positive light and tries to treat it more as a fun action adventure with some romance and some comedy, and even portrays being captured by the Germans and put into a prisoner of war camp as somehow manageable. So
great. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think film is another way that the Russian state is trying to promote its view of history, as well as television, of course. So I have less knowledge about what exactly is on Russian state-run media.
Thank you so much. That was all extremely well said, and I 100% agree with you. Right, so that in my book, I do look at some film and some TV shows, not sort of not a ton of it, but some. So the larger book deals with all Russian media as well as, and I absolutely agree with you that in fact film and TV are more powerful than these museums, because they're coming to people's homes and people watch them on a daily basis. And I think that definitely has, in some ways, it's more powerful than these museums, which you have to go to as a, sort of separately, right? But you're completely right that in the last 20 years of this, from the 60s onward, well, during the thaw and then again in the Glasnost, and there were really powerful films about war that did question them, right? So that's part of the larger project, is looking at the times when war can be questioned, like in Ivan's Childhood, or in the Ales Adamovich film, whose name I'm not coming up with now. Oh, somebody maybe can help me with that. About the little partisan boy that was done in the early 80s. That was extremely powerful anti-war film, right? So there are moments when these things can be said, and now is not that moment. You couldn't make that film. You couldn't make Ivan's Childhood now, right? That you wouldn't get money for it. And I think that's really a very interesting and important point here, that you can't just sort of that there's an ebb and flow of these, but film and TV are very important. And a lot of these films are very gung-ho. In fact, there was a major controversy about a film about the Panfilov 28, which is 28 guardsmen 28 guardsmen who were commanded by the Panfilov and who were in the defense of Moscow in 1941. And they were told that, their commissar supposedly told them, you may not retreat because Moscow is behind us. There's no place to retreat to. You have to keep on fighting. And these guardsmen supposedly gave their lives for Moscow in this context. And then when it turned out that they went to the archive, the head archivist found that there was no partisan, there was no commander that ever said that. There was no that was made up by the propaganda. And in fact, some of the guardsmen who were supposedly died were alive. And so this was in 2015. The head of the archive actually got demoted because he challenged the myth that was being made into the film. So that's a really good example of where of how how the problem of the mythic reality the myth is more important than reality, and the professionals who pointed out the reality, they got into trouble. So that's one good example of where there was a controversy about a film that made it clear that it didn't matter what the truth was, it mattered what the myth was. Thank you. But it's a great suggestion. Well, film and TV are very important, and one can't write about everything, but I do have some episodes in the book that are about film and about TV.
Leslie, thank you so much for your great question and input. We're really lucky to have you as part of our regulars and grateful for your insights.
Yeah, that was a great question.
I'm going to welcome Dr. Chris White back to the program. I believe that he had something to contribute as well to this conversation. Mm-hmm. And while we're waiting, it's interesting when you mentioned Ukraine becoming a nation in 1991. Ukrainians would say they were a nation the entire time that they were under the Soviet Union as a federation of nations. And so just kind of I'm a non-historian, but just a lifelong Ukrainian. I'm getting a lot from these conversations.
And of course, you're right that Ukrainians began to identify as a nation, deep in the 19th century, right? If not before. And so, when everybody else was identifying as a nation, right? The idea of the nation comes in the after the French Revolution, and the Ukrainians are already identifying themselves as a nation, but they only have a nation state in 1991 is what I meant to say. I didn't mean to say that Ukrainians weren't a nation, but they're constructing themselves as a nation in these 19th century ideals. They are, they are creating that idea of Ukrainian nationality. They are constructing it. It's not an inborn, you have a genetic Ukrainian gene or something, or a genetic Russian gene. It was people in Ukraine who I articulated the idea that this group of people belong together, and they did that in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you were very clear earlier too. It's just that, so thank you. I appreciate this. Dr. White, the microphone is yours.
No, and actually, to build off of what Dr. Schrey was talking about, this idea that nationalism is constructed is so fraught with controversy, right? because like and also you specialize in Jewish studies too. And so in the current context of Israel right now, when I've spoken to rabbis, or when I've spoken to religious Muslims as well, there's this idea that there is a Palestinian nationalism, or one side might discount the idea that there's a Palestinian nationalism, and so all of this is, and also with Israeli nationalism, there is a construction in this too, but then there's the reality. And so can you talk about maybe how different countries do this better than others, maybe based on their accurate portrayals of history, maybe like the way,
that's
yeah, because that's a hard thing to weigh. And
Yeah,
Russia's trying to do this.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, right? I think in particular, I mean, national identity becomes particularly fraught when there is a territorial dispute, right? So that's why, looking at Palestine and Israel, the reason why it's fraught about, who was where when and who was older, and is it's very important. The same with Russia and Ukraine in some way, right? Russia's trying to usurp this sort of earlier state that actually was on Ukrainian territory in order to claim that territory. So there is that sort of I think there, in some ways, there are two questions, like what makes a nation, and then what do nations do when they're in a territorial dispute, right? I mean, I think those are sort of two, in some ways, separate issues, and it becomes much more fraught in a territorial dispute about who is constructed as the nation. But when you look at national identity, is sort of the most famous. I think the whole idea of national identity, modern national identity, comes out of the French Revolution, really. And so if you look at France as the sort of that moment in the 1780s when France was articulating, this is who we are, these are the freedoms that French people deserve to have, and who are the French? Well, here are all the French, right? So it's a kind of that sort of a unifying, it's both creation of political sovereignty for the individual and the idea of a national unity coming at the same moment. And so I don't know that that's the best. I mean, it had ran into some troubles too. You could say the terror was not the best moment of national identity that ever occurred. But that's where this idea really starts to bubble up, right? Is this and the US American Revolution too, right? And then and then shortly thereafter the Latin American revolutions, right? So those are, we think of those as more positive elements of nationalism, where nationalism ends up articulating the idea that it's not the king that has sovereignty, but each person of the nation has sovereignty. And so it comes along with some elements of democracy. But as we know, in the American case, there were large swaths of the population, including enslaved people and including indigenous people, who were not granted that same citizenship in the nation. So it's always fraught, but I think it's particularly fraught when you get to the contested territories, and then it's really the founding of the nation, the sort of defining of the nation really ends up being about territorial ambition, and it's very difficult to untangle things. I hope does that answer your question?
Oh yeah. Well, I especially I'm what got me thinking about this, especially a couple months ago, was I saw an interview with Bibi Netanyahu, and he was with Lex Friedman, and what he was really, his whole explanation to justify Israel's existence and actions today with regard to the Palestinians was based on historical explanations. And it got me thinking that really history is it's everywhere. And people are always referring to history, and the way in which they understand history has pretty much everything to do with politics, identity as well. And yet history as a profession is seen kind of as in some ways going by the wayside by regard to, or in comparison to STEM. And it just seems like this is a reason why we need to be studying history even more.
That's right. And frankly, I 100% agree with you. Not to put too fine a point on it, the historians are awkward because they're going to challenge these national myths of all of these people by actually saying, hey, well, this is what really happened was X, that we have documentation that this happened then, and I think that one of the problems, one of the reasons why, sort of politicians don't particularly like historians is that the politicians or the ideologies are trying to use history to justify all kinds of things that they shouldn't be doing, probably. And historians are there with the papers, right? Who's got the receipts? As one of my friends, one of my colleagues always is like, well, who's got the receipts, right? It's like, where's the receipt there? And the historians are always going around and saying, hey, wait a second, I found in the archive, and that this is what happened, and therefore your argument that you own this territory since X date is wrong. That's I'm not surprised in some ways that historians are being pushed aside, because they are asking they're not willing to give up complexities. They're not willing to make a simple argument. And that what politicians want is a simple argument. And they also have the knowledge that undercuts and undermines some of the claims that politicians the world over are trying to make. So I'm not surprised that there's a war against history and a war against the humanities generally, because we're demanding complexity in a world where the people in power want simplicity.
Well
Yeah, I
said.
agree.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point to bring our program to a close. I'm very grateful to our team, to our regulars, to our panelists. This was fantastic, Dr. Petrone. Your university is lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have you for today. What a great conversation! I love the wide ranging nature of it as well. I mean, we went to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different areas. From Dean Deutsch's question to Carol Smith's question to Leslie's question, just wonderful and great to see two historians here on the screen interact. Thank you so much. We traditionally close with a couple of words to our viewers in Ukraine, so I'm going to do that and then wrap the program up. But a huge thank you to you and to all of our panelists. Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося. Take care, everyone. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you.
Heroim Slava.
Karen, could you stick around for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Are we going to turn the recording off, or yeah?
Assume. Larry, can the recording stop? Great. I think it's done.